Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late.
Together with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to be a little bit of a Tourbites instead of the regular History Soundbites, which I do occasionally, and it's because I just came back from a great tour with a great group, a shul from Cedarhurst, Anshe Emes, wonderful group, and it was a very successful tour through Poland, exploring Jewish history, and we're having a lot of tours these days with various different shuls, had some families too in the summer, but a lot of shuls. If you are one of the few shuls that haven't yet done a Europe history tour, then I don't know, no pressure, but like you don't want to feel funny like your shul is less than other shuls, and you really want to get on the bandwagon and do it before you feel left out. So be in touch with me, Yehuda at yehudageber.com, for arranging one of these Jewish history tours through anywhere in Europe and even beyond. We've done some Morocco tours too, and the Poland is definitely the most popular. So while I was taking this group around in the classic part of the tour, which is a tour through the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, which I love, it's a really exciting tour, and I just every time I go, I realize that there's so much to see in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. And obviously, you're time limited on these tours, and you can only spend a certain amount of time there. Plus, you don't want to spend too much time in one cemetery because the group will go crazy. So as it is, we spend like an hour and a half there, and we don't get to do a lot of the things because it's a vast, huge story, this Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, the largest Jewish community in Europe before the war, and it was so prominent and so central. So I decided I'm finally going to sit down and do a Tourbites of the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery with a twist, meaning I'm not going to focus on the places that I actually go to with groups. That you'll have to see when you come with me on a group. What I'm going to do in this episode is kind of like a wish list for myself for if one day I would have more time in the Warsaw Cemetery. Let's say a group would tell me we want to do 5 hours in the Warsaw Cemetery, then instead of the usual celebrity select few sites that we do, we would do all these other things that I'm going to speak about today in the episode. Because the size of pre-war Warsaw Jewish community was the largest in Europe. It was nearly 400,000 Jews. It was the central Jewish community. It wasn't just the largest, it was the main. It was the capital of Poland. Poland was obviously the center of Jewish life in general in the world before the war. So it was a center of Jewish religious life, political life, economic life, cultural life, and everything else in between. It was a diverse Jewish community. It was religious and secular. The religious community was Chassidic and non-Chassidic. The secular community was Yiddishist, Bundist, Jewish socialists, Zionists of all streams, all kinds of different Zionists. There was Jewish assimilation into Polish society. There was Polish-speaking Jews and Yiddish-speaking Jews. There was economic diversity. There was a wealthy elite. There was a lot of middle class. There was industrialists, factory workers, working class, poor. everything. There's all types of Jewish education. It was really a fascinating community, very, very interesting. And the only place you can really see it today is in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, which was largely preserved and refurbished after the war. Whatever wasn't preserved was refurbished after the war, whereas the rest of Warsaw was completely destroyed. So there's nothing to see really, except for there are a few other things to see, obviously, but the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery is really where you can get a glimpse of the amazing Jewish life in Warsaw before the war. So there's so much to see there, and we only focused, like I said, on a select few bunch of celebrities and stories. So here's kind of like the other side of it, where we walk through the cemetery and we see so many other things, and never really get to focus on it on the tours. It happens to be that I did quite a few episodes throughout the past few years that reference different aspects of this, different Chassidic dynasties, that some of the Rebbes lived in Warsaw or died there. So I mentioned that in that context. Also, there was an old episode I did about 4 or 5 years ago on the Warsaw Rabbinate. So you can reference that as well. Just a couple of months ago, I did on one of the more famous rabbis of Warsaw, Rabbi Ber Meislish. So there's other episodes that do touch on this, that I have done from time to time. Warsaw is one of my favorites, so I have returned to it again and again. This is the first time I think I'm doing a Tourbites of it. The ones that we do visit, when we go on the tours, is generally right at the beginning of the cemetery. We go to the Reb Shlomo Zalman Lifshitz, the Chemdas Shlomo, the first chief rabbi of Warsaw, and a couple of other Warsaw rabbis nearby, such as Reb Yaakov Gesundheit and Rav Avraham Tzvi, who was actually the son-in-law of the Ar Sameach, Reb Meir Simcha Udvinsk, who passed away quite young in Warsaw, Rav Avraham Tzvi. There's right behind that is the Mahar Al Tzins, Reb Aryeh Leib Tzins, who started the first yeshiva in Warsaw. Then we usually go to the mass grave of victims of the Warsaw Ghetto, who died of the physical conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. Nearly 100,000 Jews died just of the impossible physical conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. In other words, of starvation and typhus and other diseases and malnutrition and whatever it was. So there was this mass grave. The rabbis in the Warsaw Ghetto gave a psak to the Chevra Kadisha of the Warsaw Ghetto, who were allowed to do burials in the Warsaw Cemetery, which was adjacent to the ghetto, that they were allowed to bury in a mass grave because the bodies were simply piling up. It's a terrible tragedy. So we usually stop there, and there's a new memorial there that was just built a couple of years ago. And then we, of course, the highlight, the main reason why we go visit the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery is because there's a oihel deep in the cemetery where the Netziv of Volozhin and Rav Chaim Brisker, his grandson by marriage, both of whom were Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin. Rav Chaim Brisker, of course, was later the Rav in Brisk. And both of them are buried in Warsaw through a whole story of circumstances, how they arrived in Warsaw. But that's the main visit we do. And then we try to visit a few Chassidic Rebbes, such as the Modzhitz Rebbe, the Slonim Rebbe, and a couple of others. And then we generally are done with the visit after that, and we leave the cemetery. So there's so much more to see, and we don't get a chance. So here it goes. There's actually a couple that I've never even found. I remember reading many years ago when I was researching the Mir Yeshiva, which was one of my early research projects, being that I'm a student of the Mir Yeshiva, and it turns out that the Rosh Yeshiva, probably the longest lasting Rosh Yeshiva of Mir Yeshiva history, as far as I know, was Reb Chaim Leib Tiktinsky. The Tiktinsky family was the Rosh Yeshiva and ran the yeshiva and owned the yeshiva for the first 90 plus years of the Mir Yeshiva's existence, pretty much the entire history of the Mir Yeshiva in the 19th century. And Reb Chaim Leib Tiktinsky was their yeshiva for some 50 years. And he passed away in Warsaw, and I've never found his kever, so still looking for it, but he's buried there somewhere. He's a very prominent individual. And then also, Reb Meir Don Plotsky, one of the greatest rabbanim in pre-war Poland, Chassidic rabbanim. He was the famous author of the Kli Chemda, very important set of Sfarim, and he passed away in the 1920s in Warsaw, where he lived. And I have never found his kever either. In fact, when I brought my dear friend and colleague and research historian in his own right, Davi Safir, on a tour of the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, so both of us were looking for the Kli Chemdas kever, and we were unsuccessful in finding it. So hopefully one day we'll find those two. But in the meantime, those who I do know what is there, and I just usually don't get to stop there. So in the rabbi section, right near the Chemdas Shlomo, the Chemdas Shlomo is like the Chalkas HaRabbanim, the rabbi section, in other words, rabbis of the city of Warsaw. So there's a bunch of rabbis there who we don't get to usually stop by. Rav Avraham Tzvi Perlmutter, who's a famous Polish Rav, a famous Paisik and Halacha, who's one of the heads of Agudas Yisrael. He was a member of the Polish Parliament for Agudas Yisrael, and he was the head of the Warsaw Rabbinate until his passing in 1930. Is one of those rabbis buried right near the Chemdas Shlomo. And also Rav Chaim Davidson, a much earlier rabbi in the 1800s. He actually succeeded the Chemdas Shlomo as the second chief rabbi of Warsaw the Chemdas Shlomo passed away in 1839. So after the Chemdas Shlomo's passing, and that was prior to the third chief rabbi of Warsaw, who I had an episode dedicated to just a couple of months ago, Reb Dov Ber Meislish, and who was in turn succeeded by the fourth chief rabbi of Warsaw, Reb Yaakov Gesundheit, those last two who I spoke about in recent episodes. So Reb Chaim Davidson, who's the second chief rabbi, was a fascinating person with a very interesting life. He's totally forgotten today, unfortunately, despite his prominent kever being right next to his predecessor, the Chemdas Shlomo, which all the groups visit. There's other rabbis nearby. Obviously, the other rabbi we visit nearby is Rabbi Leib Tzunz, the Maral Tzunz. And right next to him, actually, is another Warsaw rabbi, Reb Chaim Yaakov Naftali Zilberberg, who I did mention in an episode I did on the rabbis of Warsaw. Right near there is another prominent kever who we try to stop by, not every time, Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter, who's the son of the Chidushi Harim. The Chidushi Harim unfortunately lost all of his children in his own lifetime. They all predeceased him. I think it was 12 or 13 children who predeceased, all of them, the Chidushi Harim in his lifetime. The Chidushi Harim, Rabbi Meir Alter, was most of his life Rabbi Meir Rottenberg, and he lived in Warsaw. He was known as the Varshva Ilui his entire life. He lived in Warsaw, only moved to the Warsaw suburb of Ger towards the end of his life, and all of his children predeceased him, and most of them as children. It's the whole story. We're not going to get into it now. One day when we do an episode on the Chidush Harim, we can discuss it further. But only one reached adulthood, Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter, and he married and had a family, several children, before passing away when he was still in his 20s. And so the Chidush Harim raised his grandchildren themselves, among them his grandson, the Sfas Emes. But there were several children. And this Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter is buried in the Warsaw Cemetery, right near the Chemdas Shlomo. In fact, there's a legend or a story that goes along with his burial, that the Chidush Harim, who inscribed his matzeva, which is a very fascinating matzeva. He writes how he lost all his children, and this was the last one, and it's so sad and it's tragic. Very interesting matzeva that the Chidush Harim wrote on his son, Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter. He's kind of like the missing link, because the successor of the Chidush Harim is this Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter's son, the Sfas Emes. And there's a story with his burial that the Chidush Harim wanted him to be buried in between two Kotzker Hasidim. He wanted him to be comfortable for eternity, and if he's not buried among his friends, the Kotzker Hasidim, then he will not be comfortable. And what kind of burial would that be if he's not with his friends from Kotsk? So the problem was that the two Kotzker Hasidim that he wanted him to be buried next to, there was no room in between the Kvarim. So there's really two versions of the story, and you see till today, by the way, that it's kind of like stuck in between the two Kvarim. It's really like no space there. So that's for sure true. The question is, one version of the story says that the Chidush Harim, he's a big tzaddik, so he made a miracle that there should be room for his son to be buried between the two Kotzker Hasidim. The other version of the story is that the followers of the Chidush Harim, the Ger Hasidim, are known to be Ger Hasidim, the Polish Hasidim, the Kotzker Hasidim, whatever they were, are known to be, they get things done, they get things moving, and a little bit of digging up here, a little bit of digging up there, and all of a sudden there was room between the two Kvarim, and Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter was able to be buried there. Right behind him is Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter's son, Rav Shlomo Alter, in other words, the Sfas Emes' brother, another grandson of the Chidush Harim. In that area is also the most important famous Jews of Warsaw, the couple, Berka and Temeril Bergson. Bergson has a very, very prominent, elaborate, artistic kever. He actually was the richest Jew in Poland, wealthy Jew. He bought the original property of the cemetery in the early 1800s. It was his acquisition. He was incredibly wealthy, most famous and important Jew in all of Poland, for sure, in Warsaw in the early 1800s. And his wife, who's buried somewhere in that area, although I don't think I've ever seen her kever, but I'm pretty sure that she is buried in that area. She was the famous Temerel Bergson who funded and financed and supported all the great tzadikim of Poland. The Chayz of Lublin, the Kazhnitzer Magid, the Rebbe Rabbinim of Pshischa, the Yiddish Kaddish of Pshischa, and many, many others. I think of David of Lelov and others. She's the architect of Polish Hasidus because she supported them all. Very important individual in the history of Polish Hasidus. Right behind that, very fascinating memorial, huge, massive, elaborate memorial for Jews who died fighting for Polish independence after World War I. And this was a very important memorial for the Warsaw Jewish community because it was a patriotic thing. They were trying to say, and this is an era of anti-Semitism, and they're trying to say, no, we belong in Poland, we're part of the Polish struggle for independence, and we're part of the Polish narrative and Polish history and Polish story. And here, look, we have all these Jews who died fighting for Polish independence after World War I, and this is this huge, massive, elaborate memorial that we want to build in their memory. Interestingly enough, the memorial never got finished before World War II and the Holocaust, when Polish Jewry was decimated and wiped out, and there was no one to finish it afterwards. And in recent years, they decided to go back and finish it, just a couple of years ago. By the way, the cemetery is still active for the small Jewish community that's still in Warsaw today. So there's still burials there, there's still maintenance, they get a lot of funding from the government, and funding from others, so that it's still maintained, and it's pretty well maintained actually, and relatively, and so just recently, a couple of years ago, they decided to finish this memorial. So finally, it got done 100 years later, over 100 years later, and now it's a full memorial. Very interesting. That memorial. Right next to that is the grave of Professor Meir Balaban. The famous Jewish historian. He was one of the pioneering Jewish historian. There weren't that many Jewish historians in his day. He wrote on the history of the Jews of Krakow, the Jews of Lvov, the Frankist movement of Jacob Frank, which is he wrote a book on it. He was really one of the first Jewish academics in the realm of Jewish history, Polish Jewish history, pioneering, trailblazing historian, a very prominent individual in Warsaw, and he also was the head of the Tachkamani Jewish seminary in Warsaw, which had a religious department, a rabbinical department, which didn't last very long, but the head of that rabbinical department was Rav Moshe Soloveitchik for a couple of years. And he and Meir Balaban, who was completely secular, did not see eye to eye. That's one of the reasons why Rav Moshe Soloveitchik left. And Meir Balaban died during the war, during the ghetto, and he got a burial in the Jewish cemetery. Not far from there is the head of the Warsaw Judenrat, Adam Czerniakow, who is a completely secular. He's part of the secular Jewish elite of pre-war Warsaw, which was quite prominent. It's not so well remembered today. There was a secular Jewish elite. They were Polish-speaking, Jewish identity, but kind of like integrated into Polish society. Very often middle class or upper class, wealthy, educated, very, very much part of Polish society, Polish speaking. So Czerniakow was right into that mold. From the 19th century, this was a Polish Warsaw elite, aristocratic elite almost. Now, so Czerniakow came from a family like that. He was an engineer, quite wealthy. He was a politician also. He served he was a political leader. He served either in the Warsaw City Council or maybe even the Polish Parliament, I don't remember. And during the war, he's appointed by the Nazis to head the Judenrat. The Judenrat, of course, was between a rock and a hard place. They were appointed by the Nazis to carry out the Nazi decrees against the Warsaw Jewish community in the ghetto. That was the role of the Judenrat, but on the other hand, they were the heads of the Jewish community. They were Jews who were the heads of the Jewish community, and they were not able to really lead the Jewish community because they were forced to carry out everything that the Nazis said. So he was quite unpopular, as were many heads of Judenrat during the war, and during the ghetto era, he was very unpopular. Again, history will judge whether he tried to do his best or there's a reason he was unpopular because he should have done more, should have done better. What is a fact is that when on July 22nd, 1942, an SS officer, Herman Hoffley, walked into Czerniakow's office and told him that tomorrow the deportations begin from the Warsaw Ghetto, and Herman Hoffley didn't tell this to Czerniakow, but it was to be, the deportations were to Treblinka, to the gas chambers. He told Czerniakow resettlement in the east. He obviously didn't tell him the truth, but Czerniakow suspected the worst, and he did not want his Judenrat, he or his Judenrat, to be responsible for these deportations. So in order to get himself out of it, he took cyanide and committed suicide the next day. So he was hailed as a hero by many in the Warsaw Ghetto by saying that he'd rather take his own life than be a Jewish Judenrat leader that is actively supporting the Nazis in the deportations. Even Ringelblum, the great Jewish historian and archivist of the Warsaw Ghetto, he praised him in his diary, which he never did. He was very critical of him for the previous 2 years in his diary. Tens of times in his diary, he's critical of Czerniakow, and this, all of a sudden, because of his suicide, Ringelblum praised him, as did others. So he has this mixed legacy, and he has this very prominent tombstone in the Warsaw Ghetto. After his suicide, he was buried, in the Warsaw Cemetery, after his suicide, he was buried there. Right near there is also, right next to him is another fascinating cover, a very colorful, elaborate grave of Ludwig, or Laser, his Jewish name, Zamenhof. Ludwig Zamenhof is the founder of the language, the failed international language of Esperanto, although there are adherents till today. There are, I think, Esperanto clubs and Esperanto conventions, as far as I know, but the language never really took off in the way that Zamenhof wanted to. Zamenhof was a Polish Jew born in Bialystok, and a secular family, and he had this vision of peace and love throughout the world through communication and language, meaning he believed that the reason that there were wars and disagreements was because people didn't understand each other. And literally, if we would have one language that everyone would understand each other, that would solve all world problems and all world peace. It would bring peace and brotherhood throughout the entire world. That was his vision. So he created this language called Esperanto, which would further this purpose, that we would have one language, everyone would learn it, everyone would adopt it, and then boom, there would be world peace. Well, it didn't really work out that well. But that was his idea. He literally created a language. He was a brilliant man. He spoke many languages. He spoke 10 languages or so, maybe even more. I don't remember how many. He was an ophthalmologist. He practiced as an ophthalmologist. That's how he made a living. He lived in Warsaw for many years. Later he lived in Vienna. It could be he lived in Paris for a time. I don't remember. But he definitely returned to Warsaw, and it was there that he died in 1917. So the founder of Esperanto is buried in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery as well. We then generally move back deeper into the cemetery, and we pass right by the graves of the Biala Rebbes. We don't usually stop there for too long, but the Biala Rebbes, they come from Pshischa, they're descendants of Pshischa, the Yid HaKadosh of Pshischa, the one who founded the Pshischa dynasty, Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak Rabinovich, who was a student of the Chayz of Lublin. So his son, Rabbi Rachmiel Rabinovich, had a son who continued him to a certain extent. Most of Pshischa continued with the Yid HaKadosh's student, the Rebbe Rabbeinu, Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa. But some continued with his son, Rabbi Rachmiel, and his son, Reb Nosson David of Shidlovitz. And then his son, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Rabinovich of Biala. He established the Biala dynasty. So it's a direct line from Pshischa. It was a very large, Biala was quite large, very influential. When Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov, the first Biala Rebbe, passed away, he was buried in Warsaw in 1905, next to his father-in-law, who is the central of the three graves in the Biala section. Even though technically his father-in-law is not Biala, he's the father-in-law of Biala, but he was an old Polish tzaddik named Rabbi Yeshua of Ostrava, who lived in Warsaw in his later years. So there's Rabbi Yeshua of Ostrava, who's the father-in-law of the Biala Rebbe. There's the Biala Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Rabinovich, the first Biala of Rebbe, and then one of Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov's son was Rabbi Meir Shlomo Yehuda Rabinovich, who succeeded his father in Biala, but then he later moved to nearby, to Modzhitz in Poland. There's another more famous Modzhitz in Ukraine, where the Maggid of Modzhitz lived. This is Modzhitz in Poland, and there was a famous Navardic yeshiva there actually in the interwar period in Modzhitz, Poland. But either way, this Biala Rebbe lived in Modzhitz. He later moved to Warsaw. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he passed away in March 1942 in the Warsaw Ghetto, just a few months prior to the commencement of the deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka, to the gas chambers. So in March, there was still some sort of stability in the ghetto before the deportations. So he was one of the last public rabbinical funerals in Warsaw, interestingly enough. Nearby is, further down the path, we go right by the Vorka Oil, the oil of the Vorka Rebbes, which I'll get to in a second. But right behind the Vorka Oil is the kever of Reb Yaakov Meir Biderman, a fascinating and very important historic personality. Now this is going to get confusing. So this is the Gerer Rebbe's family, all intermarried with each other. So this is going to get confusing. This Reb Yaakov Meir Biderman was, by the way, the Ger Bidermans are not related to the Lelov Bidermans, in case you were asking. I've gotten that question before. So this Reb Yaakov Meir Biderman was the son-in-law of the Sfas Emes of Ger. And he was the brother-in-law, therefore, of the Imrei Emes. But he was also the father-in-law of his brother-in-law, the Imrei Emes, because in the second marriage, Imrei Emes, after his first wife passed away, he married his niece, the daughter of his brother-in-law, Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman. So his brother-in-law became his father-in-law. So the Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman also was the father-in-law of his nephew, Rabbi Yisrael Alter, the Beis Yisrael, who's the Imrei Emes' son. So it's interesting that the Imrei Emes and his son, Rabbi Yisrael Alter, were both sons-in-law of Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman. In fact, Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman was a father-in-law of another nephew of his, Rav Pinchas Levin, who was the son of Rav Chaim Tzvi Levin, the Bundiner Rav. Very interesting. So he had, now through his daughter, through Yaakov Biderman's daughter, Rebbetzin Fege Minshe, who married her uncle, the Imrei Emes, in a second marriage. So Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman is therefore the grandfather of the Pnei Menachem, the Rav Pinchas Menachem Alter, the Ger Rebbe, the Pnei Menachem, and therefore, for those who like contemporary stuff, Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman is the great-grandfather of Reb Shaul Alter. Now, the Pnei Menachem published his grandfather's Torah, so Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman's Torah is around today because of his grandson, Reb Pnei Menachem. And Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman, when he was a Rav in Warsaw, he published the Torah of, or before that even, when he was in Ger, he published the Torah of his father-in-law, the Sfas Emes, with his own edition. So the Sfas Emes on Shas and all that was published by his son-in-law, Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman. He lived most of his life in Ger, but he later moved from Ger to Warsaw after World War I. He was on the Modzhitz Gedolei HaTorah of Agudas Yisrael, this Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman. He also visited Eretz Yisrael a couple of times. He was appointed to lead the Rabbinical Committee of Warsaw, together with Rabbi Menachem Zemba and Rabbi Avraham Weinberg. So he was literally one of the leading rabbis of Warsaw in the 1930s. He was the president of the Kollel Poland for the old Yishuv of Eretz Yisrael when he lived in Warsaw. He suffered from diabetes, and his health worsened in the Warsaw Ghetto because he could not access insulin and medicine that he needed for his illness in the ghetto, unfortunately. So he died in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's buried in there in the cemetery. Now, with the exception of the Pnei Menachem, his grandson, the Pnei Menachem, and Pinchas Menachem Alter, maybe one of the 11 grandchildren, I'm not sure if the 11 grandchildren come from this marriage or a second marriage, but in any event, maybe one of the 11s as well. But he had, but besides for them, all of Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman's many children, grandchildren, you're talking about a huge family, tens of people, were all murdered in the Holocaust. Almost no descendants. Very tragic. So like I said, Rabbi Yaakov Meir Biderman is buried behind the Vorka Oil. So we discussed the Vorka Rebbes in an episode I did a while ago on Vorka Dynasty, which is quite popular, by the way. I got a lot of feedback on that episode. But as a reminder, the youngest son of the founder of the Vorka Dynasty, Rabbi Yitzchak Kalish was the founder. So his youngest son, Menachem Mendel Kalish of Vorka, was buried in Warsaw. His son, Reb Simcha Bunim, moved to Eretz Yisrael at the end of his life, and he's buried in Tveria. But his son, who was also Reb Menachem Mendel, so it's the second Reb Menachem Mendel Kalish of Vorka, he remained in Poland and moved to Warsaw during World War I, and he's buried in the Ohel with his grandfather, the second Vorka Rebbe, also Reb Menachem Mendel. His brother, another Vorka Rebbe, Rav Avraham Moshe Kalish, was also a Vorka Rebbe and also moved to Warsaw after World War I. And when he passed away in 1938, he's also buried there. So there's really 3 Vorka Rebbes there. And Vorka was a significantly large Chassidic community of central Poland and Warsaw, and was almost entirely wiped out in the Holocaust. The next one we sometimes do go to, I can't say we never go to, but not as often as I would like, is the Radzymin Ohel. Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh Guterman of Radzymin was one of the most prominent students of the Chayzev Lublin, the Kuznetzer Magid, mainly of the Yid HaKadosh of Pshischa, and later his student Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa, the Rebbe Rabbinim. By the way, we do have to do a Pshischa episode someday. So the Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh Guterman of Radzymin was one of the main students of Pshischa, and he followed the Vorka side in the split after the Rebbe Rabbinim passed away. The Kotsk side was the other side, so the Radzyminer went on the Vorka side, and following Rabbi Yitzchak of Vorka's passing in 1848, so the Radzyminer Rebbe emerged as one of the leaders of the Pshischa Vorka followers in central Poland by establishing the Radzymin Chassidic dynasty. Now, Radzymin, no one ever heard of today. Very few, anyways. I can't say no one. But he, at the time, he himself, Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh Guterman, and later his descendants, were a very, very large and influential community, dynasty. He himself, Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh Guterman, the first Radzyminer Rebbe, was known, which is very rare for Pshischa Rebbes in general, he was known as a miracle worker. We could kind of call him like the Reb Shaila of central Poland, because he was the only miracle worker of central Poland. He was probably the only Pshischa Rebbe who had that reputation. And people used to go to him and have them daven for him, and people would go to his kever. It's a big zgula to go to his kever, and since it's a big zgula to go to his kever, you'd think more groups would go, but not enough times do we go. In any event, the Radzymin dynasty was quite prominent and influential. Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh himself was the last of the great Pshischa Talmidim alive. He was the last of the Mohicans. He outlived all the other great Talmidim of Pshischa, so that increased his influence in his later years. He passed away only in 1874, which was, he was an old man. His successors, meaning his descendants, his son, grandson, are all buried next to him in his ohel in the Warsaw Cemetery. Radzymin remained a major force and large influence on Polish Chassidic life until the Holocaust. In fact, Davi Safir and I wrote about one of them recently in the Mishpacha magazine. One of the last Radzyminer Rebbes, a couple of months ago, we wrote about one of them. I forgot the name of it. Either way, it was one of these descendants of Radzymin. Another one buried in that same ohel of Radzymin is Reb Nechemia Alter. Reb Nechemia Alter was a son of the Sfas Emes, a brother of the Ger Rebbe the Imrei Emes. He lived for a time in Israel, actually, before the war, in Eretz Yisrael at the time. He then moved back for family reasons, health, and other stuff, and he lived in Lodz. He was a Rav in Lodz. He escaped to Warsaw at the beginning of the war. He died in Warsaw. He passed away in Warsaw during the war. He was married to a Radzymin descendant, so they buried him next to the Radzyminer Rebbe. And in fact, Reb Nechemia Alter's son-in-law was Reb Simcha Bunim Alter, the son of his brother, the Imrei Emes. The Simcha Bunim Alter, of course, was the Leiv Simcha of Ger, the famous Ger Rebbe. And his son is the current Ger Rebbe. The current Ger Rebbe is, therefore, a Radzymin descendant. Not only that, the current Ger Rebbe is named Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh Alter. So he's named for the Radzyminer Rebbe. So Radzymin is still around a little bit through Ger. Nearby, actually right near this ohel of Radzymin, is a very interesting historical tidbit that I sometimes point out to the groups. There's a little grave of Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Alter. And this Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Alter, who obviously is named for the Chidush Yerim, his ancestor. So this Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Alter was a son of the famous Reb Moshe Betzalel Alter. Reb Moshe Betzalel Alter was a brother of the Ger Rebbe, the Imrei Emes. and he was his closest confidant. He actually was designated by him to be the next Rebbe of Ger following his passing. Unfortunately, Rav Moshe Betzalel Alter was killed in the gas chambers in Treblinka. He was a tremendous leader, very beloved in Ger Hasidus, beloved in Warsaw, especially during the years of the Warsaw Ghetto, but even before. He was one of the most important people in Ger. A lot to say about him. I think I once spoke about him many years ago in one of the first episodes of Jewish History Soundbites. I would have to double check that. But in any event, this Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Alter was a son of Rav Moshe Betzalel, and he was a son-in-law of his uncle, the Ger Rebbe, Rav Mordechai Alter, the Imrei Emes. So, again, this intermarriage in the Ger Rebbe's family. So this Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Alter, son of Rav Moshe Betzalel, son-in-law of the Ger Rebbe, and he's killed in the bombing of Warsaw during the first weeks of the war. So he's not technically a Holocaust victim. He was killed in the bombing of Warsaw during the Battle of Warsaw. But it's an interesting matzeva because it has Rav Moshe Betzalel's name on it, because it was his father. And Rav Moshe Betzalel obviously doesn't have a burial. He was killed in Treblinka. So here's Rav Moshe Betzalel's name on a grave, and it says Shlita. All right, it says that Rav Moshe Betzalel is still alive. Nearby is another fascinating grave that's always overlooked. And this is of a very important rabbi in Warsaw Jewish history, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Kanal. Kanal, I don't know how to pronounce his last name even. Fascinating rabbi and a fascinating story. He was born in Warsaw to a Ger Chassidic family, rabbinic family. He was a follower of the Sfas Emes and later of the Imrei Emes. He was a rabbi in Warsaw, very famous, charismatic, very active in public leadership, very well-known figure. He was really active in the communal sphere, communal activism and leadership. He was dealing with the Polish political authorities, very active during the Shechita controversy of the 1930s, when the Polish government tried to ban Shechita. He was the assistant, I don't even know what it's called, the Sgan of the Agudas Harabanim of Poland. He was one of the most influential and famous rabbis in the entire country before the war. He was one of the heads of the Warsaw Kehila. He lived next door to the Warsaw Kehila offices on Tvarda Street, and he served as the rabbi of that neighborhood in Warsaw. He achieved his greatest fame during the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto, and there's several different versions of this story, so I don't know which one is true. But one version has that it is the summer of 1942, and everyone in the Warsaw Ghetto was being deported to the Umschlagplatz, the gathering area at the edge of the Warsaw Ghetto, where the Nazis loaded them onto trains to Treblinka, to the gas chambers. So he's brought, this Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Kanal is brought to the Umschlagplatz, and this version of the story has him grabbing a gun from an SS officer to attack the Nazis, and he's shot. Rabbi Meir Kanal is shot and killed as a result. Or another version of the story has in the ghetto itself, when an SS officer tried grabbing him during the Great Deportation, and to bring him to the Umschlagplatz to eventually to load him onto a train to Treblinka. So it has, this version of the story has him slapping this German Nazi SS officer across the face when they attempt to deport him. And then he's shot and killed there. So either way, it seems that this rabbi, this Ger Chassid rabbi, this prominent rabbinical figure who's an older man also, it seems that he supported fighting back. Needless to say, there are many many people today who are uncomfortable with this story because prominent rabbis are not supposed to have supported fighting back for some reason. I'm not sure what the reason is, but apparently that's a view in certain communities today. They were supposed to oppose fighting back for some odd reason, but circumstantial evidence supports this story because his kever was discovered in the Warsaw Cemetery, and I know where his kever is, and I've been there, and I have pictures of it to prove it. And the date of death on his kever, buried in the Warsaw Cemetery, is in August 1942, meaning at the peak of the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. So how is he buried in the cemetery and not deported to the gas chambers in Treblinka? So that would suggest that he was shot and killed in the ghetto itself. And why would he be shot and killed in the ghetto itself? There could be a few reasons, but it would support that the sources are true. We also walk by a sewer pipe, a still active sewer pipe that was used for smuggling food into the ghetto, very often by little children who used the sewers. Imagine 10-year-old children in the Warsaw Ghetto crawling through sewers and then coming out of the top in the Warsaw cemetery, hiding among the tombstones, and then trying to steal bread on the other side of Warsaw, and then smuggling back through the sewers and the cemetery into the ghetto just to be able to feed for their family. Amazing story there. Another prominent individual buried there that we go to, that we should go to more often, is Reb Itchik Grodzinski. Reb Itchik Grodzinski was he was known actually as the Chafetz Chaim of Warsaw. He was a prominent Litvish rabbi, Torah scholar. He would host many of the Lithuanian Torah scholars who would come to Warsaw for either publishing their Svarim or for rabbinical conferences or political reasons, meeting with politicians and stuff like that. So the Chafetz Chaim stayed at his house, the Beis HaLevi stayed at his house, others also. He built many Torah institutions in Warsaw, yeshivas, cheters, others. Reb Itchik Grodzinski was a very, very important Torah leader in Warsaw Jewish history. Also, his descendants stayed there. In fact, one of his descendants who left Warsaw was Rav Avraham Grodzinski, not descendants, his son. Reb Itchik Grodzinski's son was Rav Avraham Grodzinski, who is the Mashgiach of Slabotka. We pass by also near the Radzyn. We spoke before about the Radzymin. Here's the Radzyn Rebbe. I spoke about the Radzyn dynasty in an episode about the Ishbitz Radzyn Chassidic dynasty several years ago, so you could check that out. But this particular Radzyn Rebbe is the son of the famous Radzyn Rebbe, Reb Gershon Henoch Leiner, the Baal HaTcheles, the one who thought that the cuttlefish was the elusive Tcheles. So that his son was Reb Mordechai Yosef Elazar Leiner, the Tiferes Yosef of Radzyn. Very important leader of Polish Hasidus. Radzyn, at that time, was a large and influential. During his time, he was one of the founders and leaders of Agudas Yisrael. He moved to Warsaw with the outbreak of World War I. He passed away in 1929 and is buried there in an ohel. His son succeeded him and was killed in the Holocaust. Another very interesting ohel we pass by and never stop by is the Zlatopol Rebbe's ohel. What's Zlatopol? Zlatopol is a Ukrainian Chernobyl branch from Rachamestrivka, the Twerskis. How did they end up in Warsaw, Poland? This is not well known at all. Rabbi Yochanan of Rachamestrivka, who of course was the youngest son of the Chernobyler Magid, or Matal of Chernobyl. So Rabbi Yochanan of Rachamestrivka was the founder of the Rachamestrivka Chassidic dynasty. So his son, Reb David Twersky, moved to Zlatopol. Zlatopol is very famous. Reb Nachman of Breslov lived there for a couple of years. That's where he first became Rebbe before he moved to Breslov. Very famous Ukrainian city. So either way, the Rachamestrivka Rebbe, Reb David Twersky of Zlatopol, during World War I, Reb David's son and successor, Reb Mordechai Yosef Twersky of Zlatopol, Rachamestrivka, Chernobyl, he moved to Kiev, and then he moved to Warsaw. And he passed away in 1929 in Warsaw. Most of his children were murdered in the Holocaust. One of them moved to Tel Aviv before the war, and his grandson today lives in England, and he considers himself a continuation of both Chartkov and Zlatopol dynasties. So the Zlatopol Rebbe is in Warsaw. Then we have 4 grandchildren of the Kutzker. All 4 of these grandchildren of the Kutzker were Kutzker Rebbes, Chassidic leaders of central Poland, and all are buried in relative proximity to each other in the Warsaw Cemetery. Kutsk is generally viewed as to have continued through Ger and Sachatshov, but a significant number of Kutzker Hasidim stayed in Kutsk itself, following the passing of the original Kutzker Rebbe in 1859, and he was succeeded there by his oldest son, Reb David Morgenstern, the second Kutzker Rebbe. And Reb David's descendants and their various branches of the dynasty were large and influential throughout central Poland all the way up until the war, during which almost all of them were murdered in the Holocaust. So the 4 that are buried in the Warsaw Cemetery mostly 3 of them are the children of Rabbi Yisrael Morgenstern. Yisrael Morgenstern succeeded his father, Reb David, as the Kutzker Rebbe. He was the 3rd Kutzker Rebbe, and he moved to the town of Pilov, not far away, and he was known as the Kutsk Pilov Rebbe. He was a fascinating and somewhat controversial figure for his early views on Zionism, which we'll save for another time. But his 4 sons all became prominent rabbis and rebbes and leaders of Polish Hasidus, Agudas Yisrael, etc. And 3 of those 4 are buried in the Warsaw Cemetery. Reb Yosef of Kotsk, Reb Moshe Mordechai Morgenstern of Pilov, who moved to Warsaw during World War I, and the most famous one of them was Reb Yitzchak Zelig Morgenstern, the Sokolov Rebbe. He was one of the most famous and prominent leaders of Agudas Yisrael, very charismatic, very important in his leadership of pre-war Polish Jewry, European Jewry in general, a very, very important figure. And he was in Sokolov, but at the beginning of the war he escaped to Warsaw and died in the ghetto, so he's buried in the Jewish cemetery there. A 4th grandchild of the Kotzker who is buried in the Warsaw Cemetery is Reb Tzvi Hirsch Morgenstern of Lamaj. He was another son of Reb David. He was a brother of the Pilover, in other words. He was a son of Reb David Morgenstern. He lived in the town of Lamaj for many years, was a very influential Rebbe with a huge following. He moved to Warsaw later in life, and when he passed away in 1926, he was buried there. He had many children from 3 marriages. Almost all of his descendants and his Hasidim were killed in the Holocaust, wiped out. The whole Lamaj community and family was wiped out. It's worth noting, though, that the Reb Nechemia Alter that I mentioned earlier was his son-in-law, was the son-in-law of the Lamaj Rebbe. So the current Ger Rebbe is a descendant of Lamaj. There are a few other descendants who survived. He also had a son. This Lamaj Rebbe had a son who lived in Israel and England and the United States. He moved around a lot. His name was Rabbi Chiel Meir Morgenstern. He was a bit eccentric. He was very involved in kashrus. He was also involved in kivrei tzadikim on Har Hazesim of all places. He passed away in Israel without children in 1974. There's also an Amshinov Ohel in the Warsaw Cemetery. Amshinov is a branch of Vorka. Rabbi Yaakov David Kalish of Amshinov was an older son of Rabbi Yitzchak of Vorka, and he established the dynasty of Amshinov as a branch of Vorka. His son, Rabbi Menachem Kalish, succeeded him, and he escaped to Warsaw during World War I, where he quickly emerged as a leader in helping the war refugees find shelter, food, and resources. He passed away shortly afterwards, and he's buried in Warsaw. One of his sons was the famous Amshinov Rebbe in Shanghai, Reb Shimon Shalom. There's also the Zvalin Ohel, the Zvalin Rebbe. He's right next to his brother, Rabbi Yisrael Taub of Modzhitz, who we usually do stop by. Go back to the beginning of that dynasty. Rabbi Cheskel Taub of Kuzmir was one of the most prominent tzadikim in Poland of the 19th century, one of the closest followers of the Chayz of Lublin. His 3 sons established several dynasties of Kuzmir. One of them was Yablona, famous Yablona Rebbe, recently became, that was one of his descendants. Another one was Reb Ephraim and his descendants. But the most influential was Reb Shmuel Eliyahu Taub, who moved to the town of Zvolin from Kuzmir to Zvolin. One of his many children of this Zvolin Rebbe was Rabbi Yisrael Taub of Modzhitz. So the whole Modzhitz dynasty comes from him. But he had a bunch of children, and all of his children had branches of the Zvolin dynasty, quite a few children actually. A few of them moved to Warsaw, as did Modzhitz also. They all moved to Warsaw and were buried there. So the Zvolin Ohel is the 3rd Rebbe in the Kuzmir dynasty, and the whole family was musical. So the Zvolin was just as musical as Modzhitz was. The next branch we have are a bunch of Litvish Chassidic Rebbes, the Koidenov Rebbe, and the Novominsker Rebbe, and the Slonim Rebbe. Actually, right nearby is the Radomsk Rebbe, which we generally do stop by. And the last Radomsk Rebbe was killed, was shot by the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Great Deportation. Reb Shlomo Chanukh Rabinovich, very important historical figure. But him we usually do stop by, so we're not going to talk about him on this podcast. But we're going to talk about these 3, Koidenov, Novominsk, and Slonim. So the Perlov family, which was Karlin, the Karlin Hasidus was the original Litvish Hasidus. That in Chabad were the Hasidus of that area of White Russia. And the branches and descendants of this Karlin Hasidus include these 3. Besides for Karlin itself, there's also Koidenov, Novominsk, and Slonim. There's a few others as well. We're not going to get into that. Kobrin, a few others. I'm talking about these 3 that are buried in Warsaw. All 3 of these ended up in Warsaw at some point. Koidenov was an adopted Perlov, meaning the family name wasn't originally Perlov, but the original Koidenov Rebbe was adopted by the Karliner Rebbe, so he adopted his adoptive father's last name. So Kaidanov was a very influential dynasty, relatively significant in size. By the way, Reb Moshe Feinstein was from a Kaidanov Chassidic family. Reb Moshe Feinstein's father, Reb David Feinstein, was a practicing Kaidanov Chassid until he went to Yeshiva in Volozhin and he became a Litvak. Either way, Reb Nechemia Perlov was the Kaidanov Rebbe when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and he eventually escaped Kaidanov and settled in Baranovich, which was on the Polish side of the border. So he became the Kaidanov Baranovich Rebbe. He had a large base medrash of Kaidanov Hasidim in Baranovich, and he opened a Kaidanov yeshiva there as well. He was also close with the famous other Baranovich yeshiva, and its Rosh Yeshiva, Rebbe Chanan Wasserman. And many of Rebbe Chanan Wasserman's students in the Baranovich yeshiva would get their meals provided by the Kaidanov Rebbe. I'm not sure how many people know that. And I also don't know how he ended up in Warsaw, but he's buried there, right there in Warsaw. Right next to him is the Slonim Rebbe, the Divrei Shmuel of Slonim, Reb Shmuel Weinberg, who I discussed on the episodes of Slonim, which I did a while back. You can check it out there. The Slonim Rebbe escaped to Warsaw during World War I, and so he's buried there. Interestingly enough, one of the sons of the Slonim Rebbe who succeeded him was Rav Avraham Weinberg, the Beis Avraham of Slonim, and he leaves Warsaw and moves to Baranovich, where he established the Teiras Chesed Yeshiva. So you have in one town of Baranovich, the Teiras Chesed Yeshiva of Slonim, the Kaidanov Yeshiva of Kaidanov Chasidus, and Reb Chanan Wasserman's Yeshiva, of the Litvish Yeshiva of Baranovich. Not far away from them, in the Warsaw Cemetery, is the Novominsker Rebbe, another Perlov from a similar branch of the Kaidanov dynasty. The second Novominsker Rebbe, Reb Alter Yisrael Shimon Perlov, was the second Rebbe of Novominsk, and during World War I, he escaped from Novominsk to Warsaw, and he established his court there. He was a very prominent leader of Polish Hasidus in the interwar period, and he passed away in 1933 and is buried in Warsaw. He was succeeded by his younger son, Reb Yosef, who was killed in the Holocaust. His older son, Reb Nachum Perlov, had immigrated to the United States, and he was the Novominsker Rebbe in the Lower East Side, and his son was the famous Novominsker Rebbe who passed away a couple of years ago. By the way, this Reb Alter Yisrael Shimon Perlov, the Novominsker Rebbe of Warsaw, also raised his nephew, who is an orphan, a fellow by the name of Abraham J. Heschel, who is a fascinating figure, and we got to do an episode on him one day. Many other Rebbes of the family of the Piasetzner Rebbes we actually do go to, so I'm not going to talk about that. There's too numerous to mention how many other Rebbes are there. We're already way over time in this episode. Many of them, I don't even know their history. It's just so amazing that tens of Rebbes lived and were buried in Warsaw. And the way I want to summarize that is that the urbanization of the Chassidic movement, primarily during World War I and as a result of World War I, but it's something that kind of started even before World War I, it changes the Chassidic movement. And the Rebbes moved to the big cities, primarily places like Warsaw, where there were tens, probably 40, 50 Rebbes who lived in Warsaw in the interwar period, some more famous, some less famous. And in other cities, Krakow and Lodz and Vienna and others, which is a foreshadowing the Hasidus of today, the Hasidic movements of today, where I would guess that upwards of 90% of all Hasidic rabbis today live in one of three cities, Bnei Brak, Yerushalayim, and New York. So, I guess the Skver Rebbe, is an exception, a couple of others, but almost all of them live in one of those three cities. So that trend really started because of World War I, and slightly before that, the urbanization of the Hasidic movement. And it's a fascinating story, and we really see that story and that whole narrative, which is a great chapter in the history of Hasidus, of how it came from a movement from the shtetl to the city, and its Rebbes moved to the city, and what that does to the movement. There's no longer an Aliyah L'Regel, a pilgrimage to the Rebbe. You just, it's down the block, and you're today in Borough Park, but then in Warsaw, you could go to Nalevki Street, and there's like 12 Rebbes living on Nalevki Street, and all kinds of things like that. So there's lots to talk about in that context. I'm going to continue. Feel free to turn this off if it's boring you at this point, because this is longer than most other episodes go. But what can we do? The Warsaw Cemetery is huge, and there's so many interesting stories. There's Rebbetzin Malka Shapiro, Reb Meir Shapiro's wife, who Rab Meir Shapiro was buried in Lublin and later transferred to Har HaMenuchos in Yerushalayim. But his wife, they were childless. They didn't have children. They both died in their 40s, 7 months apart. Very tragic. And Rebbetzin Malka Shapiro was seeking medical attention in Warsaw, and she passed away there and is buried there. Right next to her is a very interesting Rebbetzin, a really cool story. Rebbetzin Kayla Nechama. She was the daughter of Rav Avraham Eger of Lublin. The Eger family of Lublin, descendants of Reb Leibel Eger, the Lublin Chassidic dynasty that came from Ishbitz. So this Rebbetzin Kayla Nechama, she was born in Eger, and then she's first married to Reb Shol Yedidya Taub of Modzhitz, the Modzhitz Rebbe, famous Modzhitz Rebbe. They got divorced, but her descendants are the Modzhitz Rebbes till today. She then remarries Rabbi Yirmiyahu Kalish of Ofula, who is the youngest son of Rabbi Yaakov David Kalish of Amshinov. So it's a branch of Amshinov. He was killed in the Holocaust, this Rebbe, but she predeceased him, and so therefore she's buried in the Warsaw Cemetery. And to make it another Warsaw Cemetery connection, her husband, Rabbi Yirmiyahu Kalish of Ofula, had smicha from Rav Chaim Brisker, who's buried in the Warsaw Cemetery. Then, when we're done with the Chassidic rabbis, we go down to another part of Warsaw history. There's the Yiddish writers' Ohel. 3 very famous and important Yiddish writers, Y.L. Peretz, Yitzchak Leibish Peretz, who was one of the greatest Yiddish writers ever, probably second only to Shalom Aleichem, maybe Mendel HaMoicher Sfarim, but Y.L. Peretz is one of the most important and prominent Yiddish writers in Yiddish writing history. So he's buried there. He lived in Warsaw most of his years, was very influential. And 2 other Yiddish writers are buried next to him, Yaakov Dinazin, and S. Ansky, who was also quite famous. Shlomo Zanvil Rappaport, whose pen name was S. Ansky, he wrote on ethnography also, so he's important for historians. He did a long tour, like a 2-year tour through the Pale of Settlement, and wrote down about Jewish communities and cemeteries and customs and culture and all kinds of things, besides for his regular Yiddish writing. Then right near there's the section, the Yiddish theater section. Yiddish theater in Warsaw was founded by Esther Kaminska, Mama Esther, and there's others. There's actors and directors and screenwriters, all for the Yiddish theater, and this whole section of the Yiddish theater. It's fascinating. Yiddish theater was very, very prominent in Warsaw. Many members of the Warsaw Yiddish theater moved to New York, where they founded the New York Yiddish Theater on 2nd Avenue on the Lower East Side. Later on, their descendants become some of the founders of Broadway. Till today, Broadway is a very Jewish-dominated, descendants of these Polish Jews who from the Yiddish theater, and many of those went to Hollywood. So Hollywood, you could say, to a certain extent, started in Warsaw by this Yiddish theater section, and I tell the group sometimes as we're passing by that I made up a segula that no one has taken me up upon yet. That if you want to win an Oscar, you want to win an award by the Academy Awards, then you should send a minyan to daven at the Esther Kaminska Yiddish theater section in the Warsaw Cemetery. But and no one really has taken me up on that yet. Then on the main path, there's a Bund memorial. A memorial for leaders of the Bund who were killed by Stalin. So they don't have a burial anywhere. But these 2 were leaders of the Polish Bund. The Bund was the Jewish socialists. They believed in socialism and they believed in Yiddish culture. That was the twin beliefs of the Bund. They were the largest Jewish political party in Poland before the war. Very dominant, very powerful, very anti-religious, very anti-Zionist. They believed that Poland was their home, Polish patriots, but they wanted to push socialism, a socialist economy, socialist government, and Yiddish culture, Yiddish language, Yiddish culture. So 2 of the leaders of the Bund political party were Victor Alter and Henrik Ehrlich. And those 2 were killed by Stalin at the beginning of the war. There's no burial, so there's this memorial for them in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. Interestingly enough, Henrik Ehrlich was a son-in-law of the famous Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, and Ehrlich's wife and children were able to escape. They didn't get killed by Stalin or in the Holocaust. His wife and children escaped. They made it to Vilna and got Sugihara visas, which led them through Japan and China. And they were so this Bundist family got the Sugihara visas and made it to the United States. Their descendants, who are descendants of the Bund and of Shimon Dubnov, they live till today. Grandchildren are alive till today. Then there's a whole Bund section. Bundist section. There's the famous Bundist warrior from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Marek Edelman, who survived the Warsaw Ghetto uprising by escaping through the sewers. He stayed in Poland as a true Bundist. He became a cardiologist and lived in Lodz. Remained a Bundist throughout his life. Lived a long life and died just a few years ago as the last surviving senior officer, fighter, commander, whatever you want to call it, of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And they buried him in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. He's buried right next to his close friend, Michal Klepfish, who was a Bundist leader. Very interesting personality as well, and he had a major role in the early days of in the lead up to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and was killed on the second day of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and they managed to bury him in the cemetery. To me, all of these stuff really provide an insight into the size and scope and influence and the centrality and the diversity of pre-war Warsaw Jewish community. It was not just a bunch of Chassidic Rebbes. It was all types, religious and secular, and all fascinating, really, of the kaleidoscope of Jewish life in Poland before the war. There's a few memorials right nearby at the entrance to the cemetery. There's the Ringelblum Archive Memorial, the Roinik Shabbos Archive, a relatively recent memorial. There's the Janusz Korczak Memorial, the famous educator, and who also was the head of the orphanage. He was a pediatrician, he was an educator, he was the head of the orphanage, and his story of going to Treblinka with his orphans in the ghetto, together with his assistant, Stefania Wilczynska. There's a children's memorial, and just a few weeks ago they put up a memorial for Alex Danzig, a very prominent Holocaust researcher, historian who I knew very well. I heard many lectures from him in Yad Vashem. And he was a Polish citizen born to survivors after the war, and then moved to Israel, where he lived in kibbutz near Oz for many, many years. And he worked in Yad Vashem, and he worked in Poland, very prominent in Holocaust history and research, and he was taken hostage by Hamas on October 7th, and he was murdered in cold blood by Hamas just a few months ago. His body was recovered by the IDF, and he was buried in his kibbutz. So they put up a memorial for him, being that he was a Polish citizen and a prominent Holocaust historian. They put up just a couple of weeks ago, they put up a memorial for him in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. There's much, much more in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery, but I think we've had enough at this point. I was excited to do this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And if you do enjoy this kind of stuff, then you'll probably enjoy a tour too. So make sure that you start booking your tours. This is Yehudi Gerber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigerber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.